Someone told me last week that I didn't introduce myself. Was that necessary, you guys? Do I need to introduce myself? Yes. Okay, I will quickly introduce myself because there's a couple of things you have to be ready for. One of those things is that I am a really, really intense word nerd. I love words. I look up words in the dictionary for fun. Okay, that's bizarre, I know. But I've been doing that ever since I was like a 7th or 8th grader, just because I think it's fun. I know that's bizarre. And I'm into this thing called etymology. If you know what etymology is, that's great. If not, I'll tell you. It's how a word is put together in its original context. So it's like from Latin roots or from Anglo-Saxon roots or from Greek roots. I like to look at the roots of words. You're going to get a taste of that tonight. I'll probably have a definition or an etymology of a word in every single presentation I do because this is the reason. Because the world rises and falls on definitions. It absolutely does. And we're in a place in our world where definitions mean nothing. They can be whatever it is that you decide that they are. But words have meanings. And when the church uses words, she has specific meanings for words. So I try to explain all that stuff as I go in presentations because it's important that we understand language. Language is so important. And it seems like such a simple thing, but stuff goes over our heads culturally all the time. So because I'm a word nerd, I have this thing up here that someone gave me. I've been at Spirit of Christ for 20 years as the youth minister, and I've loved it. I have a master's degree in theology, and it's just one of my great loves is to teach the faith. Some teens got me this because I love puns. This is a Darth Tater. And Darth Tater got stolen a while back, and there were the Tater nappers, and there was this whole long story that went on with it. I was getting emails saying that they were threatening my Darth Tater, and I was quite distressed over that, actually. The other thing that kind of helps define me is this guy. I am a bit of a Tigger, which means I'm distractible, and I kind of laugh that way. So I'm excited about all kinds of things, and you get the benefit of being in a place where you can understand the thing I'm most excited about. There are 3 things in my life that I'm most excited about. The first one is my wife, because it ought to be that way. I would be in trouble if it wasn't. The other is my children, and then the next one is the church. I love the church, and I've been studying the church my whole adult life. When I was in high school, I was reading The City of God and not understanding a whole lot of it. But you know, how many high schoolers do you know that read Augustine? Like hardly any, right? I read The City of God. I've read other things by St. Thomas Aquinas. I was halfway through the Summa by the time I graduated high school. I'm a bizarre person. I understand that. But this is the thing that I love. And there's no way that one human being could never absorb everything that the church can teach. And I just get excited about it, and I get kind of bouncy because that's kind of who I am. And when I giggle, I kind of sound like Tigger. Yeah, it is true. And I can actually do a pretty good imitation of him. I'm Tigger. So yeah. But tonight we're going to talk about some broad, very, very broad things. And the first one is, well, not the first one. This whole night's going to be about the spiritual life. And I wanted to start out with other things because there's a definition for spiritual. But I didn't have time to put all the slides together. Because here's the thing. Everything that has a spirit is spiritual. Which means human beings, regardless of the place that they are in their development, are spiritual. Babies, when they're first born, are spiritual. Babies, when they're first conceived, are spiritual because they have a spirit, they have a soul. Animals, according to St. Thomas Aquinas, have a spirit. That's what gives them animation. That's what allows things to move. In some respects, the wind has a spirit. We actually think of the wind as the spirit and the wind in like synonymous ways because it moves. Anything that has an ability to move has a spirit, according to St. Thomas Aquinas. That doesn't mean it has a soul. It has a spirit. Those are they're different things. I'm not going to get into all that. It's another day. But everything in our life that we interact with really can be spiritual. And that's what I want to talk about. There is a thing, some of you who went to Christy's presentation, Christy is very well versed in this because she's been working with me for 12 years. She's like my sister. We think in very much the same terms a lot of the times, except I make more sense. Oh, poor Christy, I know. I love her. But well, because I make more sense because it's my brain, and I don't understand girls' brains very much. But you guys, for those of how many have a junior high schooler? I'm just curious, just so I know. Okay, not very many. So that'll change the way that I present this. The spiritual life, and all of life really, because all of our life is spiritual in some context, and I'll explain this, has to do with friendship. Okay, and this is where everything starts for us, because we're made to be friends, to be not just friendly, but to be friends. Have you ever had a bad day and been grumpy and seen the way that people treat you because you're grumpy? When you start treating people in a specific way, you get that back. And when in my own life, when I see that people are being rude to me, I'm like, oh my, what am I doing? Because I must be being rude. And I can be very rude. That's a reality. When I get tired, I can be really, but this intensity cuts both directions. I'm intense like this all the time. And it's really good or really bad. I'm almost schizophrenic. But it's true. This intensity, I'm intense all the time. And it kind of wears people out if they're around me for long periods of time, which is why the teens call my wife a saint. Because she is. That's Saint Stephanie. Our whole spiritual life kind of revolves around friendship, because this is the way that we are made. We're made to be connected. Then if you're going to follow this through a flow, and then we're going to break this open. The next thing that is in this level is trust. In order to have a friend, you have to trust that person. And you try little things along the way when you're first getting to know somebody to see whether or not you can trust them. And being able to trust people allows you to be vulnerable with them. For some reason, this word is a bad word in our culture. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on vulnerability. But it's not a bad word. It's actually a really, 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 really good word. And then vulnerability, if you're able to accomplish that, leads to community. I'm going to define that in a minute. Which leads us to an encounter. This is, like in church, leads us to an encounter with Jesus, or actually the end of what the friendship is based on, which leads us to mission. Now, this happens not just in the church, in our spiritual life with Christ. It happens in every aspect of your life. This happens in sports. Take Jesus out, put soccer in. This happens in school. Take Jesus out, put the name of your school there. This happens really big time for college students with school, because everything becomes about the school, and that's why that whole school spirit is such a big thing in college. This happens with sports teams. This happens with every aspect of your life, because all of life is spiritual. This can be a really good thing or a really dangerous thing, depending on how you're looking at it. There is one thing that is important in our life. We're made for actually just one purpose. And I'm going to do a whole presentation on this probably in the spring. But we're made for just one purpose. That purpose is to get to God. He put us here so we could get back to Him. And we have built inside of us a homing device that's trying to get us to go back. We put up the walls. God wants us back. And then we try to substitute God with things. Name it. You could put anything in place of Jesus there. And you'll encounter it, and you'll encounter it on a deep level. I like to use sports as an example because we're a sports-crazy society. Or you could put dance up there. You could put politics up there. Whatever people get engrossed in is they're just putting Jesus and putting that in the place of Jesus, because that drives us then to a mission that supports that encounter. Does this all make sense? This is in every single aspect of life. There is one aspect of life that is way more important than all the other aspects of life combined, and that's our relationship with Christ. Jesus died for us. We know that in our mind. We hear that all the time in homilies. We understand that cognitively. But the space between here and here is great. To get from this level to this level sometimes takes years to try to sink into that heart level, because it requires intense vulnerability, because God knows everything about you. And that should make you, when I say that, that should make you a little bit uncomfortable, because he does know everything about you. If there was a human being that knew every single thing about you, would you even want to be in the same room with that person? Seriously, it freaks you out a little bit. But God knows everything about you. He knows all of the private thoughts. He knows all of the reasons why you do things. He knows all of your motivations. He knows more about you than you do. And that should make us a little uncomfortable if we take it seriously, because he knows everything about us. So this is what we're going to run through tonight. And let's just get started running through it. Friendship. We're made for friendship. Every single human being on the planet is made to connect. Every single one of us. In Genesis chapter 2, that's about Adam and Eve, and it's traditionally about husband and wife. But do you know what how the church defines marriage? In Vatican II, the church defines marriage this way. It's a special kind of friendship. I tell you what, if you're not friends with your spouse, you have a serious problem going on in your house all the time. There are times in your relationship, I know this because I am a spouse and I have a spouse, there's times in your life when you're not friends with that person at all. And you don't want them to be friendly with you. that happens. And when that happens in your life, in your house, and you become, in a sense, living in a community that causes you to be lonely. I know that's that way in my life. I know that's that way in my wife's life. And whenever we start getting at odds with each other, and even if it's not even really like fighting, we just start, there's times when you kind of don't see each other a whole lot during the week and stuff, and you have to almost introduce yourself to them again at the end of the week. Anybody else in here having that? This happens to me all the time. But when I know that I'm starting to feel lonely, which is a hard thing for a male to even accept, right? Because we're impervious to everything. We're not. I understand that Stephanie's probably been lonely for some time. And I have to fix that. And I'm the one that makes those kinds of steps, because Stephanie's way more of a receiver than I am. I'm much more of the giver side. And that's just the way our relationship is. That's not the way every relationship is. I understand that. But that's something that's unique between us. And we discovered over a long period of time that is an important thing, that if I'm feeling lonely, she's been lonely for days. And that's a red flag to me. And I can we've been married for 31 years, and finally I can catch when she's starting to feel lonely quickly. This takes a lot of time and a lot of practice, a lot of effort, but we're kind of getting closer to being on the same page most of the time. So I make effort along the way when I start to see that she's starting to get lonely. This shocks people, but I'm a massive introvert. I know that people don't understand that about me, because I do this kind of thing. But I'll talk more about that at another day. But I am really a big introvert, so alone time is really important to me. But when I see that Stephanie's starting to be lonely, I cut my alone time down a lot, actually, so that I have less of it, but it fills my wife, and that's a good thing. Because I'm made for her friendship, and she's made for mine. Relationships as spouses are good. Families are communities where there's friendship floating forth between parent and child and spouse and the two spouses, and all the children that are involved in the house. My children are sometimes really good friends, and sometimes they're really big enemies. And that's just the way that kids are. I mean, then my youngest one is a senior in high school. And still, the oldest one and the youngest one get at odds with each other because they're very similar to personalities. So, and Richard doesn't even live with us. He hasn't lived with us for a long time. He's 30 years old. So, Daniel and him still get at odds. And they're so much different, and they're totally different lives and different lifestyles, but they get at odds with each other. And it just doesn't ever change. Sorry to tell you that. But it's the reality, because we're made for companionship. And when the companionship becomes strained, the system becomes strained. We hate it. I mean, Richard and Daniel don't see each other a lot. And they don't interact a ton. They're not texting each other a lot. But Richard comes over for dinner, and we get the family together and stuff. And that's the times that Daniel and Richard see each other. Okay, they're few and far between. But when they become opposed to each other, the whole family system is messed up. Even if they're not in the same house, it's ridiculous. Because we're made for companionship. That word companionship comes from a Latin phrase, con pan. It means to break bread. Companionship literally means to eat together. Ever had a meal where you didn't have companionship with the person who you're eating with? Happens all the time at your house. I know it does because it happens in mine. Probably like once or twice a month, we're in a situation where I don't want to talk to her and she doesn't want to talk to me, and then the children can't get anything passed to them at the table. They're like, hey, can you? All right, we just want. we're going to starve. That kind of stuff happens because we're meant to be for each other, and we have to find ways to mend those things. So friendship is a massive, massive issue in the spiritual life. Having friends who are aligned in the same way that you are will push you forward in your faith dramatically, which is why the small groups that we're talking about is important. It will push your spiritual life dramatically forward. My wife and I were in a small group from the time that we were engaged until we still are in kind of a small group with these pretty much the same couples, with the exception of two. One of the spouses died, and the other one's moved to Kansas. But anyway, you don't need to care. You don't care about that. But this was our community, and we were all we were all married at about in the same year. We were all like going through our marriage prep together. We went through all of the marriage prep, including the sexuality portions of it. And the women were way, way okay with talking to each other like that, and the guys would be like, "Oh, we're just going to go over here and talk about football." But that was so helpful, not just to them, but for us, because that's communication. It's the height of communication, actually. So I'm not going to get into that too much, but I think I'm starting to begin to beat a dead horse. This is so important in your faith life, to have friends who are helping you face the same direction as the church, which is sometimes uncomfortable, but always good. Because let me give you just a secret. We are not called to be comfortable. We are called to be holy. And I don't know a whole lot of holiness that is not uncomfortable. Holiness is just uncomfortable because in order to become a holier person, you have to become less and less selfish, which means you learn how to be a better and better friend. It's crazy how this works. The next thing is trust. You have to trust someone who you're friends with. And when you first meet somebody and you're not friends yet, you find little tiny ways to test the person who you're engaging with to see whether or not this person is trustworthy. And this is an important thing because even Scripture tells us to test friendships. I wanted to read you something before we move on from friendship. I wanted to read this to you. This is from Sirach, chapter 6. I need my glasses because I'm old and I don't have them. Maybe I should get somebody like midway through to hold the book. A faithful friend is a sturdy shelter. He who finds one finds a treasure. A faithful friend, the emphasis here is on the word faithful. Okay. A faithful friend finds one, a faithful friend is beyond price. No sum can balance his worth. A faithful friend is a life-saving remedy, such as he who fears God finds, which means only people who fear God can find true friendship. That's crazy. For he who hears God believes accordingly, and his friends will be like himself. That's just a great way to end that whole little section on friendship, because it's so vitally important to the spiritual life. I can't even, because eventually when we get through this whole model, our friendship should be with Jesus. And then that friendship with Jesus leads us to a mission that deepens our friendship with not just him, but with everybody else. We'll talk about that in a minute. So we trust little by little by little. And I love that this is like a mathematical thing, because it's consistency over time. You learn to trust somebody when they're consistent over time. And you learn to distrust people when they're consistent over time too. Because if somebody consistently does something that pushes you the wrong direction, you will not trust that person. So it's about consistency over time, and even inconsistency over time will lead you to or away from trust. This is an important thing, and it cycles around that we'll talk about in a minute. Which trust leads us to vulnerability. I don't know if anybody have read anything from Brené Brown. She's awesome. She's not a faithful person as far as I can tell. She's a professor at Dallas University. She does a lot of research on blocks to happiness, which is misery. She interviews people who are miserable, and then she finds out what it is that makes them miserable. It's a really interesting. She's written several books, and she's like on a speaking circuit and stuff now. But she says this: vulnerability sounds like truth, feels like courage. Truth and courage aren't always comfortable. Is that the truest statement you've ever heard in your life? Truth and courage are never comfortable. She can't always even say always. It's never comfortable. But they're never weakness. Never, never weakness. And here's the interesting thing. We think about vulnerability in negative terms. Like there are two sign language words for vulnerability. They're this. This is one word for vulnerability. It's weak need, which is what most of us think about when we think about being vulnerable, right? We think about, being weak. That's not what vulnerability is about. The other way to sign vulnerability is this. And that is what courage is all about. The word courage comes from a Latin root, cor, means to open your heart. Because if you can't be courageous, you cannot love. If you can't open your heart, it's impossible to love. This is how human beings are made. This is how God wants it to be. We have to be able to open our heart. We have to be willing to be vulnerable. And the more willing we are to be vulnerable, the more our heart grows open. It's really easy inside of a place where you don't know a whole lot of people to be sheltered, to close up and go, no, okay, I'm not going to share that. This is one of the safest places in the world, inside this building. And this is one of the greatest places that you can share your life and not be judged. This is one of the greatest places where you know that you can get support and that you can get really good counsel. Because what we're all about as Christians is to lead each other to Christ, which is really to lead each other to heaven. That's what we're all about. So as these small groups begin to move and grow, try to remember that. Now here's the thing about vulnerability. Inside of vulnerability, when you're the one being vulnerable, it feels like weakness, doesn't it? Always. When there's somebody across from you being vulnerable, that seems like courage to you. It seems like courage to you because it is. Being vulnerable requires you to be courageous, where you feel the fear and you do it anyway. That's what courage is about. It's to share your heart, to open your heart. And when you open your heart, you learn more and more how to love. I tell you what, I need to learn to love. I'm going to always need to learn to love. We all have to learn to love because we can't do it perfectly, especially on our own terms. We have to be moved toward that, and this is the reason why we need community, which leads us to the next thing. It's the reason why we need community and why we're built for it. Vulnerability leads to community because when you become vulnerable with another person, you get put in that confidentiality circle with them. And they have a circle of confidentiality with other people. And then you become a part of that connection with everybody else who you know that they can be vulnerable with. And it creates like this connection where everybody can kind of be together. And this is how groups of friendships become groups of friendships. It doesn't just happen that way. People learn to trust each other based on the vulnerability that they're willing to share with each other. Our small group, we can talk about literally anything. If somebody's struggling with a specific thing in their life, and it could be as serious as alcoholism, it could be as serious as an impending death in their family, we're okay with talking about it. But it can be as lighthearted as football. It can be as lighthearted as literally joking. This is the depth of our small group, though. And we love each other tremendously. And we push each other always toward Christ. This is what a small group's supposed to do. And hopefully you'll find this kind of strength inside of this little community that we're going to be building. This is the basis of what this program, the Achor, is supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about community, so that you can be able to raise your children inside of a community that believes the same thing that you do. I think it's so cool that one of my kids can get on the phone and call one of the dads in our small group and complain about my intensity because he doesn't feel safe enough to do it to me. So my child's needs get met because of his willingness, because of his closeness to this other dad in our small group. That's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful that this kind of relationship between our kids and the parents of other kids works that way. Their kids come to us, our kids go to them. It's absolutely beautiful. And we know that when they go to one of our friends to get counsel, they're getting really good counsel. Because our friends believe the same thing we do. Because they're tight with the church, just like we are. And they're tight with the church like we are because we pull each other together inside this community called Spirit of Christ, where we worship in friendship. You know the reason why people sit together at Mass? There's a reason for that. People find their own little spot, right? And then you sit there and you're always in that one little spot. And then you're always with people who are around you. You know exactly where everybody sits. And the priest knows where you sit too, I promise you. He knows exactly where it only takes about 4 weeks for a priest to figure that out. It's awesome. So you do that because you become close with the people you worship with. That's a reality. You become close with the people who you share your life with, or you share on a deep level. And when you are in a state of worship, you are opening your heart at a very, very deep level, whether you realize it or not. And to receive the Eucharist with the people who sit around you is a very intimate thing. Because the Eucharist is a very intimate thing. That's going to become very clear to you over the next few months. So, this is how community gets built. It gets built based on vulnerability and sharing and the willingness to continue to open yourself. It's a great gift, which leads to an encounter with Jesus in the context of faith. It can lead to an encounter of anything outside of the context of faith, which is the danger of it. Because when it leads to an encounter of something other than faith, it's pulling you away from faith. That's a hard thing to even say, but it's a reality. Because there's that which is true, and then there's that which is not true. And those two things are at odds with each other. There's things that the church stands for because the church stands in truth. There's things that society says are okay to do and okay to be, and that pushes against truth. If you have good friends, they will call you out of those things and into the truth. If you are a good friend, you'll accept that kind of correction. And you'll be willing to do that same kind of correction with your friends because of this vulnerability thing that happens. We should constantly be leading each other closer and closer to Christ. That should happen that way in your family, with your spouse, and with your children. And it should happen with your friends, and it should happen with your children's friends, and it should happen with the way that you're inside of your circle of friends that your children have. This is the way that the world gets changed by Christianity, by faith. And if you look at the way that the world is right now, we've been kind of huddled together inside of some place that's safe and not going out very often because we're not changing the world. That's what leads us to mission. It's the final thing, because when you understand who Christ is, really understand the fact that you were once dead and now you are no longer dead, you want to shout that from the rooftops. That is the reality of my story. Because I was once dead, literally on my way out because I nearly took my own life, and had an encounter with Jesus that set me straight. When you understand the depth of what it means to have a Savior, you want to shout that from the rooftops. Because our faith, surprise, surprise, is not a private thing. And it's society that is trying to tell us that our faith is private. That's a lie. Your faith is public, and every rite in the church, every single rite in the church, whether it's or a funeral or a wedding or anything that is celebrated in the church as an official rite, is open to the public. Did you know that? So you can literally walk into somebody's wedding and sit in the back, and they can't tell you to leave. They could, but officially they can't, because that's a public thing. Weddings are these massively public things. Funerals are massively public things. You know why? Because they're supposed to help change the world. They're supposed to help change the world, because this is the mission that we're on. When you understand who Jesus really is, you can't keep quiet. And that really is good news. I'm the director of evangelization. I love the title. You know what evangelization means? It literally means, okay, well, I'll tell you the quick exegesis of the word. There was, when the Romans had, it comes from a Latin root. When the Romans had a victory in some kind of a war, or it could have been almost anything, but usually it was the emperor that would he wasn't always at the battle, but he was always away. When the battle was about to be won, the emperor would leave the city, which is crazy, because he wanted to make it seem like he was part of the battle, whether he was or not. Marcus Aurelius was a part of a lot of battles. I'm not going to get into it. I'm a big nerd about history. Anyway, the emperor would leave the city, and then when the battle was won, there was a person who was sent out as a runner to go into the city and to evangelion, to speak the good news. And he would scream and sing, "The battle is won. This is great news. This is the good news. The battle is won." And then the emperor would ride in on his chariot, and people would be throwing roses and flowers and palms, and they were, to celebrate this great news. Well, that's what evangelization means. It just means to tell the good news. That's it. And we have the greatest news on earth. Jesus conquered death. Holy cow. That is amazing news. My mom died about 17 or 18 years ago. I can't exactly remember the date. But I've never been without my mom a day in those times, because I know that Jesus died for her. And I know that she lives. She didn't just used to live. She lives now. And she's more alive than I am. And that brings me so much joy that I can hardly stand it when I think about it. Any person in your life who has died is more alive than you, because Jesus has conquered death. And you can pray for them with that kind of a context, and your prayer is powerful. Make no mistake about that. This is the reality of our faith. And that's good news. Does it require us to make some sacrifices in our life? Yep. Does it require us to amend the way that we live sometimes? Absolutely. Does it lead us closer to Christ? Yes, it does. And the closer we are to Him, the closer we are to everybody who He died for, which is you, and you, and you, and you, and my mom. for your kids, for your spouse. And we become even more connected when we understand that reality. Because human beings were never meant to be alone. Ever. We were meant to be a part of the community of the Trinity. That's what it was supposed to be like. And Jesus opens that way to us. And it's a dramatic thing. That's not a quiet little thing that we should be huddled around in our own little circle about. That's incredible. And we should live in that kind of fashion. The way I used to say this to the teens is that we should live out loud. Because we, even in the state of the church the way it is right now, have nothing to be ashamed of. Because the church herself is holy. There are some men in the church who are not. And that makes me actually really, really sad. But the church herself is holy. Because the church herself is the mystical body of Christ. Emphasis on the word mystical. This thing that we belong to is not a club. It's a mystical experience. It's a mystical body where miracles happen. Where things make sense that don't make sense any other way. So this flows from friendship to trust. And trust and vulnerability move around each other constantly. Because trust, the increase in trust leads to an increase in vulnerability. And the increase in vulnerability leads to an increase in trust. And this is a beautiful, beautiful cycle when you understand it. Because whenever you look at somebody being vulnerable, that looks like courage to you. So just be courageous. It's okay. This is the safest place in the world. And then, that continues to build a deeper community, which leads us to a deeper understanding of who Christ is, which leads us to a deeper understanding of what the mission is that we're supposed to be about. That mission is to lead others to Christ. And when you are a part of a mission, whether it's part of a team or part of a battle with somebody or part of anything, when you are struggling with someone, you become tight with those people. And then the mission becomes more intense. This is the reality of our faith. Because all of it is the spiritual life. Some aspects of it are more spiritual than others. We're going to pray for protection for our kids and for this program, and Jolene's going to lead us in that. So.